Who would come up with an idea like this? An upright coffin designed not just to trap someone, but to injure them from all sides with sharp metal. The Iron Maiden, later called the Eisenjungfrau, has become one of the most recognizable symbols of supposed medieval cruelty. But its true story is buried under myths, fear, and selective retellings of history. The device looked like a human-shaped box, tall, narrow, and with doors that closed over a person. Inside, it was lined with iron spikes carefully placed to avoid killing the victim instantly. Instead, they were wounded in sensitive areas like the eyes, limbs, and sides. Once shut inside, a person would be stuck in total darkness, in pain, unable to move, and left to suffer slowly. Although it's often linked to the Middle Ages, no physical version of the Iron Maiden appears in historical records until the late 1700s. One well-known example was kept in Nuremberg, Germany, but it's now believed that it was based more on earlier torture methods than on any actual medieval device. Still, the idea behind it fit with how punishment was viewed at the time. It wasn't just about justice. It was meant to send a message and scare others. Writers like Johann Philipp Siebenke's described the Iron Maiden in gruesome ways back in 1793, though most experts today think those accounts were either overdone or made up. Even if the Iron Maiden wasn't used widely, it reflects a darker truth. During times like the Inquisition or under the Holy Roman Empire, torture was official policy. Tools were designed not just to cause pain, but to break people's spirits. Silence wasn't just demanded, it was forced through suffering. What happens when your body is stretched past what it can take, joint by joint, until nothing else exists but pain? The rack, sometimes called a stretching frame, was no legend. It was a real tool used across Europe, especially from the late 1200s into the early modern era. Its design was simple. A wooden rectangle with rollers at each end. A person was tied by the wrists and ankles. As the handles were turned, their limbs were slowly pulled apart. This caused serious damage, dislocations, torn tendons, and long-lasting injuries. It wasn't made to kill, but to wear someone down over time while they stayed fully aware. In England, it was used during the rule of King Edward I and later by Tudor rulers. A version of it was kept in the Tower of London's Lower Wakefield Tower. Some called it the Duke of Exeter's daughter, after Thomas Exeter, who's said to have introduced it in the early 1400s. It was used on all kinds of people, men, women, nobles, commoners, but especially on political prisoners and those accused of heresy. One known victim was Guy Fawkes, involved in the 1605 gunpowder plot. After being tortured, possibly on the rack, his handwriting turned from a shaky mess to a faint signature. His suffering came through in ink. Even Sir Edward Coke, a top legal figure in 1603, once said, "The law of England does not allow torture, but in some cases the king's command is obeyed." That comment shows how easily laws could be bent when power was involved. The rack wasn't just a punishment. It was a way to force out confessions. Words were pulled from people through physical agony. And for many, the damage didn't end there. Paralysis, long-term pain, or deadly infections were common aftereffects. How do you inflict pain and control someone without cutting or bleeding? The Judas Cradle, also called the Culla di Juda in parts of Italy and Spain, was used mostly during the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. It was meant to shame and hurt, not to kill quickly. The setup was basic, but brutal. A wooden or metal pyramid sat on a stand. The victim, often unclothed, was tied up and slowly lowered onto the tip. The point wasn't sharp. It was deliberately made dull. That way, it wouldn't pierce the body, but instead press painfully against the most vulnerable parts, like the lower stomach or censored areas. People weren't dropped. They were suspended just above the tip and lowered inch by inch, sometimes over hours or even days. Any movement or noise made things worse. It was built to destroy someone mentally and physically without immediate death. Still, serious internal injuries and infections could follow, leading to death days later. There's less detailed record of this device being used compared to things like the rack, but it's known to have been employed during interrogations, especially during the Spanish Inquisition in the 1400s and 1500s. The goal was simple: extract a confession, and pain was the tool. In earlier times, people could face brutal punishment for going against religious teachings, questioning authority, or simply being suspected of doing so. Pain was viewed as a way to cleanse the soul. Although there are no first-hand quotes about the Judas Cradle, texts from the era show how people justified its use. One of the most telling is the Malleus Maleficarum, a 1487 guide for inquisitors. It claimed torture was allowed if someone refused to confess, or if evidence seemed strong. That mindset helped normalize suffering as part of justice. What made the Judas Cradle especially harsh wasn't just the pain. It was the public humiliation. Victims were stripped, exposed, and degraded. It wasn't just about physical punishment. It was designed to break a person's dignity. The Pear of Anguish, also known as a choke pear, was another tool of control. It targeted the body's most sensitive areas and made the act of speaking or even breathing a source of pain. Shaped like a metal pear split into 4 parts, it could be inserted into the mouth, rectum, or other sensor parts. A screw turn at the top caused the petals to expand, tearing tissue, stretching muscles, and sometimes dislocating bones or causing internal bleeding. Records show it was used from the late Middle Ages to the early Renaissance, mainly during religious interrogations. Blasphemers might receive in the mouth. Others were tortured based on their alleged offenses. Though real examples exist in museums, many historians think it wasn't widely used. Instead, it likely acted more as a threat. Still, the fear it created was very real and very effective. This device reveals how far authorities would go to control people, invading even the most private parts of their lives. The breaking wheel, or Catherine wheel, turned execution into public spectacle. Used for centuries across Europe, it wasn't just an execution method. It was a warning. Victims were tied to a large wooden wheel, either flat or upright. Executioners would strike the limbs with a heavy bar, breaking bones while avoiding arteries to keep the person alive longer. The aim was maximum pain over time. Afterward, the shattered body was often displayed, laced between the wheel's spokes and raised for all to see. Birds would feed, and the body would decay in view of the town. It sent a lasting message. One well-documented case happened in 1581 in Munster, Germany. Peter Stump, accused of witchcraft and cannibalism, was publicly executed by wheel. Records say he was hit 37 times before being dismembered. Despite myths of saints surviving the wheel, the reality was far worse. Instructions for its use were even written into law in places like France and the Holy Roman Empire. French legal writer Jean Bodin called it a necessary terror. To many, it wasn't cruelty. It was justice through fear. These devices weren't just punishments. They were tools of control. They show how systems use fear to demand silence and obedience. Even though these tools are gone, their legacy remains. They challenge us to ask, when fear becomes justice, what happens to truth? As jurist Andrea Alciato warned, torture confounds the innocent. It does not convict the guilty.